welcome everyone to Chapter 1. In this chapter, we're just going to talk about some general overview information regarding drug use. We'll talk about some general principles of what drug use is, so we're all kind of on the same page to understand what we mean when we talk about that throughout the rest of the semester. We're going to go over some terms, which we'll get into as we go, as well as some just general information about why people might be more likely to use drugs for a multitude of different reasons. So again, this is a relatively short chapter designed to just get us all on the same page and just give you a general information about what's going on in this course. All right, well, let's go ahead and get into Chapter 1, which is just a general overview of how drugs are used and some different things to talk about here in this chapter. So we're going to go over some general principles of drug use. We're also going to talk about some important terms to be aware of here. Talk about some correlates of drug use as well, and then some antecedents of drug use and things that might cause people to be more likely or potentially less likely to use different sorts of drugs. All right, so let's start off by talking about some general principles of drug use here. So number one, I want to talk first about the fact that general use is not necessarily abuse. There's two different kind of sides to this. And there is a line that sort of gets drawn when we're talking about abuse. So most users of any given substance really don't use it in ways that can be defined as addiction or as a substance use disorder. So it's also important to remember that every drug has multiple effects here. So although some users might seek only one effect, every drug itself acts at multiple ways and on multiple parts of the body. Also, amount matters, right? So large doses or frequent doses can have larger effects than maybe small or minuscule doses over shorter periods of time, or even single doses at a given time. So that's also important to kind of keep in mind here. I also want you guys to think about that the user's history and expectations are really a powerful influence over the psychoactive drug effects here. So experienced users really react differently than new users. Oftentimes experienced users may report more of the positive effects of a drug and less of the negative effects. And sometimes the expectations really can influence the user's experience. So if they've had positive experiences in the past, they may be more likely to remember those or think that that's what's going to happen in the future. And then, of course, we want to really kind of frame this from the sense that drugs are not necessarily good and they're not necessarily bad, right? So any drug that produces effects might produce some benefit when used in the right way, or has the potential to produce some harm when abused as well. So blaming the substance really can kind of not be the best way to approach this, right? We want to think about all the factors as well as the positives and the negatives, as well as the user that can kind of go into this effect here. All right, so let's talk about some important terms that I want you guys to be aware of and to understand. Number one, obviously, is just drug, right? So this is any substance, whether natural or artificial, other than food, that by its chemical nature alters structure or function in a living organism. Illicit drug specifically is a drug that is unlawful to possess or use. So it's against the law to use an illicit drug. Deviant drug use are drugs or drug use that is not common within a social group and that is disapproved of by the majority. So things that generally aren't accepted by different groups of people. Then we have drug misuse, and this is different here. So this is really the use of prescribed drugs in greater amounts or for purposes other than those prescribed by a physician or say a dentist or something like that. So this is really talking about prescribed drugs used in an incorrect way. Then, of course, we have substance addiction here, right? So this is the case where people have struggled to control their substance use and have often sometimes had some negative consequences from that use. All right, so those again are some important terms to keep in mind. These are also defined in your textbook. So if you're following along with the textbook, there's some more information there as well. And of course, you can look up these definitions, but these are the important terms to kind of keep in mind as we go throughout this chapter. All right, next let's talk about some correlates of drug use. So what is a correlate? So a correlate itself is basically just a variable that is statistically related to some other variable, in this case, maybe drug use. So I put marijuana up here on the list because most research that kind of looks at these drug correlates often and so far has really looked at marijuana smoking sort of as an indicator, mostly because there's a lot of data, a lot of use of this drug. And so it's easy to kind of look at how it correlates with other factors as well. And so because a lot of people may have tried this in particular, there's more data and more reference points to kind of look through. Let's also talk about some risk factors and some protective factors of these correlations or correlates of drug use. So what is a risk factor? A risk factor is really things that might lead someone to be more at risk for higher rates of drug use. Protective factors tend to be things that are correlated with lower rates of drug use. So I have some up here on the list here you can see, but so we'll go through each one here. So deviant drug use tends to be, so adolescents who are likely to maybe smoke cigarettes or drink heavily and smoke marijuana are also likely to engage in other deviant behaviors and often tend to not do well in school. So that tends to be a risk factor we can see. Gender also is one that we've seen in the data where males tend to be more likely to use tobacco or smoke marijuana and use cocaine specifically than females are in this case. For race and ethnicity, really some examples here are that white people tend to be more likely to drink alcohol, use tobacco, or use cocaine than African Americans or Hispanics. That's based on some of the data here in the US at least. Level of education, some examples here, young adults with college degrees tend to be more likely to drink alcohol and less likely to use tobacco compared to those with just high school degrees. And then personality can play a role here as well, right? So it might be a smaller role than some of these other factors, but it does kind of come into play here. So again, whether someone decides to try alcohol or marijuana can play a factor here just in whether or not they have other, motives for trying different drugs. Impulsive individuals might be, more likely to use drugs at higher rates. And so what I have here to kind of show you is a table that kind of lists some of the risk factors and then also some of the protective factors here as well. And so these kind of fall in order of importance. So risk factors, again, are those that are going to cause people to be more likely to engage in drug use, and protective factors are going to cause people to be less likely to engage in drug use. So take a look at this table and you can kind of see how some of these play a role here as we go. And then last, of course, I'll just note that genetics does play a small role here. There is still a lot of research and data kind of being disputed on this, I think, but there is some level of genetics that may play a role here, but not as much as some of these other factors. So it's a much smaller piece of the pie here, if you will. All right. So let's talk about some antecedents of drug use. So what are some things that might cause people to be more likely to engage in drugs, or that we can see people tend to do prior to drug use? So antecedents itself is a word, right? Is a variable that occurs before some event, such as the initiation of drug use. So it's not necessarily what causes drug use, but it may be sort of a sign that someone may be likely to use drugs in the future. So let's look at some examples here, right? So some examples of antecedents might be just being generally aggressive, having conduct problems, maybe some poor academic performance, attachment to drug-using peer groups, or even maybe some parent or community norms that tend to support drug use. Now, oftentimes these kind of get misaligned with gateway substances, right? Or a gateway drug. You may have heard that before. Oftentimes it's associated with things like marijuana. But this is really something that's, is only a small factor really when we're looking at some of these effects, right? So when we talk about drugs, remember drugs are any type of chemical substance that alters the body. So if we look at things like nicotine, caffeine, alcohol, these more common drugs that people are around the world use in fairly high frequency, it's hard to then point figures at other drugs as sort of gateway drugs. So really a gateway substance should maybe perhaps best be thought of as some early indicators of a general pattern of deviant behavior, maybe that results from some variety of psychosocial risk factors, right? So basically the idea that if people are more likely to use some of these drugs, they might be more likely to try other ones in the future. Not that these drugs have caused them to sort of go down the path of more heavy drug use. And then, of course, there are different motives for drug use, right? So different motivations to why people tend to use drugs in the first place, right? So maybe they, again, have some identification with some deviant subculture, some group of people that just likes to, get together and use these different substances. Maybe they have just general rebellious behavior, or there are also reinforcing properties of drugs, right? That sort of keep people coming back, right? They can get things like addiction and things like that. Maybe they have some desire to experience some altered state, right? They're trying to sort of get away from their daily life or sort of escape into this psychological state, or possibly even some of their own experiences that they've had in the past with a drug, maybe some positive experiences that they're trying to relive or search out for. So what I have here is basically some antecedent, or sort of some influences on drug use, So you can see here that they kind of break down into some different categories, right? So they have some individual influences, right? Like personality, knowledge, or personal beliefs of drug use. But then there are also community and family aspects as well, right? Does your family often engage in these, behaviors, or your peers, or your local police influence on this situation? And then also we have the larger picture of the societal view of drugs, right? So are there larger, patterns of thoughts when it comes to certain substances? For example, things like coffee or caffeine tend to be pretty well accepted in society, whereas heroin, on the other hand, probably isn't very accepted in society. So all of these levels come into play when someone is being influenced or not influenced to use a drug. All right, and that wraps up chapter 1. I hope you all have a great rest of your week. It's a short week. Next week, we're going to jump in and get started with chapter 4.